She hesitated to enter her late husband's garage, but when she finally crossed the threshold, what she saw shook her to the core. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sharp, insistent ringing of the phone pulled Bethany out of a restless sleep. She groaned, rolling over in bed, reluctant to wake up just yet. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 7:58 a.m. in red numbers, taunting her with how little sleep she had gotten. The summer heat was already creeping through the windows, making the air thick and stuffy. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the noise to stop, but the ringing continued, shrill and unyielding. Her phone, sitting on the nightstand, vibrated insistently with each ring. She reached for it with a sigh, still groggy. A blocked number. Her fingers hesitated over the screen. She normally didn't answer unknown calls, especially on a Saturday morning. It was probably a telemarketer or a scammer, trying to sell her something she didn't need. But the call wouldn't stop. Whoever it was, they were persistent. With an annoyed sigh, she swiped to accept the call and pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice was rough with sleep, tinged with irritation. A cheerful, elderly male voice responded. "Good morning. I'm calling about the garage. You're selling it, right?" Bethany sat up straight, her drowsiness instantly forgotten. The garage. She hadn't thought about it in weeks, not since she had listed it for sale over a month ago. She had almost given up hope of selling it. There hadn't been a single inquiry, no interested buyers. The location was terrible, on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a quiet industrial zone. She had assumed no one wanted it. Now, out of nowhere, someone was calling about it. "Yes," she said, her voice suddenly alert. "I'm selling it." "When can I see it?" the man asked. "I live nearby, just across the street. Been looking for a place to park my car. I've got the money ready too. If I like it, I'll pay you on the spot." Bethany's thoughts raced. It was unexpected, but if this man was serious, she had a real chance to finally be rid of that garage. It was something she had inherited after her husband Richard's death, a remnant of a life that no longer existed. She had never actually used the garage herself, not once. "Come by at 3, she said. "That should work." "Great. See you then." The call ended. Bethany lowered the phone, staring at it for a moment. She had to go there first. She couldn't just show up at 3 without knowing what kind of mess awaited inside. It had been years since she had even laid eyes on the place. Her stomach twisted uncomfortably. Richard had been secretive about that garage. Whenever she had suggested using it for storage or even renting it out, he had refused, sometimes angrily. At the time, she had thought he was just being possessive. Some men had their little sanctuaries, workshops, man caves, places they didn't want to share. She hadn't questioned it too much, but now something about it felt different. After his death, she had barely thought about it. She had only remembered it when sorting out legal matters, adding it to the list of things she needed to sell. Now that someone was actually interested, she realized just how little she knew about what was inside. She wasn't going alone. Bethany reached for her phone again and scrolled through her contacts. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing call. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Bethany?" "Hey, David," she said. "I need a favor." David was Richard's cousin, though the two men had been more like brothers. After Richard's death, David had been her rock, stepping in whenever she needed help. He was good with fixing things, handling practical matters, everything Richard used to do. He had been there when she had to handle the funeral, the paperwork, even dealing with little things like fixing the broken pipes in her house. "What's wrong?" His voice was instantly concerned. "Nothing urgent. I need to check out the garage before I show it to a buyer today. I haven't been there in years, and I don't know what kind of shape it's in. I don't want to go alone." David was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if he too had noticed how strangely Richard had treated that garage. "Of course," he finally said. "What time?" "I was thinking of going around 2. "All right, I'll meet you there." Bethany let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thanks, David. I appreciate it." "Any time." She ended the call and set the phone down, rubbing her hands over her face. There was a strange feeling in her chest, something between nervousness and dread. She had never been inside that garage, not once, and she had the unsettling feeling that what she found there would change everything. The sun was high in the sky by the time she pulled up outside the garage. The air shimmered with heat, the pavement nearly glowing from the summer sun. The industrial zone where the garage was located was nearly deserted, the only signs of life coming from a few parked trucks in the distance. David was already there, leaning against his truck, arms crossed over his chest. He looked up as she parked and gave her a small nod. "Hey," he said as she stepped out. "You ready for this?" She wasn't sure, but she nodded anyway. The garage was an old structure made of faded metal and rusted hinges. It had been Richard's before they were married, something he had owned even before he met her. It had always seemed like such a small, insignificant part of their lives. Now, standing in front of it, she felt like she was on the edge of something much bigger. David pulled out a crowbar just in case the old lock was rusted shut. But when he tried the handle, the door gave way with a loud creak. Bethany tensed. The interior was dark at first, the air stale and thick with dust. David found the switch and flicked it on. A single overhead bulb buzzed to life, casting a dim glow. Bethany took a step inside and froze. Every inch of the garage walls was covered in photographs, hundreds of them. Some were large, framed, others smaller and pinned up haphazardly. They were everywhere. And they were all of the same woman. A stunning blonde with piercing eyes and an effortless smile. In some of the photos, she was alone, laughing, twirling in a summer dress, sitting on a beach with the sun glowing behind her. In others, she was with a little girl. Bethany's stomach twisted painfully as she took in the sight. The child looked no older than 5. She had the same golden hair, the same piercing eyes, and she looked unmistakably like Richard. Bethany's breath caught. Her hands clenched at her sides. She felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. David stood beside her, equally frozen. "What the hell?" he whispered. Bethany couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only stare at the undeniable truth staring back at her. Richard had another family, and he had hidden them right here, all along. Bethany stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the walls of the garage. The sheer number of photographs overwhelmed her. Hundreds of images covered the space, large framed portraits, smaller snapshots, some pinned to a makeshift corkboard, others scattered haphazardly on shelves. Each picture told a silent story, a story she had never been part of. A beautiful blonde woman smiled at her from every angle, her piercing blue eyes filled with warmth and life. She was laughing in one photo, twirling barefoot in a sunlit field in another. In some, she was at a cafe, sipping coffee with an easy grace that made Bethany's stomach twist painfully. And then there were the ones with the little girl, a toddler in a pink dress clutching a stuffed bear. A slightly older version of the same child sitting on the blonde woman's lap, giggling as she reached for a birthday cake. Another photo, taken on a beach, showed the woman lifting the girl into the air as the sun set behind them. The child's hair was golden, tousled by the wind, her tiny arms stretched out joyfully. Bethany's breathing became shallow. There were other photos, too, ones that made her hands tremble as she reached for them. Richard was in some of them. In one, he sat at a table in a dimly lit restaurant, his hand resting lightly on the blonde woman's shoulder as she smiled at the camera. In another, he stood on a front porch, holding the little girl in his arms while the woman leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Bethany felt like she was drowning. Her stomach twisted violently, her vision blurring as the reality of what she was seeing crashed over her. Richard had another family, a woman, a child, a life that had nothing to do with her. David, who had been standing beside her in stunned silence, finally spoke. His voice was low, cautious. "Beth, you okay?" The question was absurd. How could she be okay? She turned her head, slowly, looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. He was staring at the photographs, his jaw clenched. There was something in his expression, a quiet, simmering anger. Bethany swallowed hard. I don't understand," she whispered, though the answer was staring her in the face. David exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't think there's anything to understand," he said. "It's all right here." Bethany's knees felt weak. She reached out, gripping the edge of a workbench for support. "I need to sit down," she muttered. David immediately pulled over an old stool, steadying her as she lowered herself onto it. She pressed her hands against her temples, trying to force her mind to process what she was seeing. Her husband had led a double life. Not just an affair, not just a fling. He had a child, and judging by the timeline of the photos, this wasn't something that had ended years ago. The most recent pictures weren't old. Richard had been with this other woman while he was married to her. Her hands curled into fists. She had never suspected, not once. Yes, he had traveled often for work. Yes, he had always been a bit distant, a bit withdrawn, but she had trusted him. Her throat felt tight, her skin hot. She forced herself to take slow, deep breaths. Panicking now wouldn't change anything, but she needed answers. Bethany pushed herself to her feet, steadying her shaking legs. She turned to the shelves, her eyes scanning the cluttered space. Richard had always been meticulous. If he had a secret like this, he would have kept records. There had to be something. A box in the corner caught her eye. It was an old wooden chest, the kind that looked like it belonged in an attic, forgotten and collecting dust. She hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside it. The latch was stiff but not locked. With a small grunt of effort, she lifted the lid. Inside, she found stacks of envelopes. Some were addressed to Richard, others to a name she didn't recognize. Her heart pounded. She picked up a bundle of papers tied together with twine and carefully unwrapped them. The first document was a birth certificate. Her hands trembled as she read the name, Maria Peterson. Father, Richard Peterson. Mother, Julia Milkova. Bethany's breath came in sharp gasps. It was true. The little girl in the pictures, Maria, was Richard's daughter. The next document was a property deed, an apartment located 500 miles away, registered under Maria Peterson. Bethany's hands gripped the paper so tightly that it crumpled. He had bought them a home she had never known about. A sickening realization twisted in her gut. He had been planning for them, providing for them, taking care of them, while she had been his wife, believing in a marriage that had been nothing more than a lie. She felt like screaming, but she didn't. She wouldn't give Richard that power. Not anymore. Bethany forced herself to stand. David watched her cautiously. "What did you find?" She handed him the birth certificate without a word. His face darkened as he read it. His jaw clenched. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. Bethany exhaled shakily. "There's more," she said. "An apartment. He bought them an apartment." David looked at her sharply. "Where?" 500 miles away." Silence stretched between them. Bethany turned back to the chest, digging through the rest of the papers. There were old letters, receipts for money transfers, handwritten notes in Richard's familiar scrawl. Everything was here. Everything. All the evidence of his deception. All the proof that he had loved them. Had he ever loved her? Bethany swallowed the lump in her throat. It didn't matter anymore. She was done being the oblivious wife. She had spent a year grieving him, mourning a man who had lied to her. Enough. She looked at David. "I need to find them." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Beth, I have to. I need to see this woman, and I need to see Maria." David studied her for a long moment. Then, with a quiet nod, he said, "Then let's go find them." Bethany let out a slow breath, steadying herself. She had spent the past year living in the past. Now, she was finally ready to face the truth. Bethany sat in the passenger seat of David's truck, staring out the window as the road stretched endlessly ahead of them. The passing scenery blurred, but she barely noticed. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers still gripping the edges of the birth certificate she had taken from the garage. Maria Peterson, Richard's daughter. Bethany had spent the last year grieving a man she thought she knew, a man she had loved. Now she realized she had been mourning a ghost, an illusion built on half-truths and deception. The world outside the car felt surreal, as if it no longer belonged to her. Every familiar landmark they passed seemed foreign, distant, as if she were looking at it through a pane of thick glass. The weight of the papers in her lap felt heavier than they should have, as though they carried the burden of an entire life she had never known existed. David's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. He hadn't spoken much since they left the garage, but she could sense the frustration simmering beneath his quiet demeanor. He had been close to Richard, had trusted him, and now, like her, he was left questioning everything. Finally, after miles of silence, David spoke. "We should start with the apartment," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's the most recent address listed in the documents." Bethany nodded numbly. It made sense. The address was 500 miles away, in a different city. Richard had made sure his two lives never intersected, but now those carefully drawn lines were beginning to unravel. She unfolded another document, the deed to the apartment. It was under Maria's name, not Julia's. Richard had secured a home for his daughter, but what about Julia? Had she lived there too? Another thought nagged at the back of her mind. If Julia had left the country, as the man renting the apartment had said, where was Maria? Bethany wasn't sure what she expected to find at the apartment. Evidence of Julia's departure, a trail leading to Maria, a final, undeniable confirmation that Richard had built an entirely separate existence? Or worse, nothing at all. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, willing herself to focus. She needed answers, but she wasn't sure she was ready for them. David glanced at her, his voice softer now. "You don't have to do this today, Beth." "Yes, I do." Her voice came out steady, more resolute than she felt. She had to, because if she didn't face this now, she never would. By the time they reached the city, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the streets. The apartment was in a quiet residential neighborhood, a modest complex with neatly trimmed hedges and a small playground in the center. It was the kind of place that felt safe, stable, a home. Bethany's stomach twisted. Richard had built a home for them, for Julia, for Maria, not for her. David pulled into a parking space, turning off the engine. He exhaled sharply, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. "Ready?" Bethany swallowed hard and nodded. They got out of the car and walked toward the building, the weight of the moment pressing down on Bethany's shoulders. The man who had rented the apartment answered the door after a few knocks. He was in his late 20s, wearing a loose t-shirt and jeans, his expression wary as he took them in. "Yeah?" Bethany hesitated, suddenly uncertain of what to say. David stepped in. "We're looking for information about the previous tenant, Julia Milkova." The man's brows furrowed. "I already told you. I don't know much. She left a few months ago, said she was moving overseas." Bethany's pulse quickened. "Did she leave anything behind? Any mail, a forwarding address?" He shook his head. "Nah, she took everything with her. The landlord might have something, but as far as I know, she just packed up and left. The place was empty when I moved in." Bethany's heart sank. This wasn't what she had hoped to hear. "Did she say anything about her daughter?" she pressed. The man looked puzzled. "Daughter?" Bethany exchanged a glance with David. "You didn't see a kid living here?" David asked, his voice careful. The man shook his head again. "No. I mean, I knew she had one, but the way she talked about it, I assumed the girl was already gone before she moved out. Julia never mentioned her much, just that she had a kid and things didn't work out." Bethany felt a cold chill creep up her spine. Maria hadn't been living here when Julia left? Then where was she? She took a slow, shaky breath. "Do you know how to contact Julia?" The man hesitated before shrugging. "She left a number for rent payments, but I don't know if she still uses it." Bethany forced a tight smile. "Can you give it to us?" He looked at them for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah, hold on." A few minutes later, he handed David a piece of paper with a phone number scrawled on it. Bethany took it, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had something. A way to reach Julia. Maybe even a way to find Maria. David thanked the man, and they headed back to the car. Bethany stared at the number, her mind racing. Was she really going to call? Would Julia even answer? Would she tell her the truth? David leaned against the car, watching her. "We don't have to do this now." Bethany took a deep breath. Yes, she did. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number. The call rang once, twice, 3 times, then a click. A woman's voice, smooth but uninterested. "Hello?" Bethany's heart pounded. "Julia Milkova?" A pause. "Who's asking?" Bethany steadied herself. "My name is Bethany Peterson." Silence, then a soft, bitter laugh. "Well, well, took you long enough." Bethany's grip on the phone tightened. "Where is Maria?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. Julia didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, edged with something unreadable. "She's not with me, if that's what you're asking." Bethany's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" Another pause, then Julia sighed. "It means she's in a children's home." Bethany felt the breath leave her lungs. No, that wasn't possible. Richard had provided for Maria. He had secured her future. He had bought her a home. And yet, she had been abandoned. Bethany's hands trembled. "You left her?" Julia's voice turned cold. "Don't act surprised. I never wanted a kid in the first place. Richard did. But then he died and I was stuck. I had my own life to live. Bethany felt a sickening mix of rage and disbelief. You put your own daughter in a children's home? Julia scoffed. You say that like I threw her on the street. She's fine. It's a decent place. She'll grow up, she'll be fine, and I'll be living my life, finally free of all this. Bethany's pulse thundered in her ears. This woman had abandoned her child, Richard's child, and she acted as if it were nothing. Bethany's grip tightened on the phone. Where? She demanded. Where is she? Julia let out an amused sigh. Why do you care? Bethany didn't hesitate. Because she's my husband's daughter. Silence. Then Julia laughed, a dry, mocking sound. Fine, she said, I'll give you the address, but don't expect a happy reunion. That girl doesn't even ask about her father anymore. Bethany felt something break inside her. She had spent the last year mourning Richard, questioning everything about their marriage. But now there was only one thing she knew for certain. She would find Maria, and she would not let her spend another day alone. Bethany stared at the phone in her hand long after Julia had hung up. Her fingers tightened around it, her knuckles turning white. The conversation echoed in her mind, Julia's indifferent voice grating against her nerves. She's in a children's home. She'll grow up. She'll be fine. Bethany's stomach twisted with a deep, seething anger. Julia had spoken about Maria as if she were an inconvenience, a loose end to be tied up and forgotten. The thought of a 6-year-old girl, Richard's daughter, left alone in a facility, abandoned by the only parent she had left, made Bethany's blood boil. Beside her, David shifted in his seat, his brows furrowed in concern. She really just left her? He muttered, shaking his head. Jesus. Bethany took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. We need to find Maria. David nodded, his jaw tightening. Did she at least give you an address? Bethany glanced down at the piece of paper where she had scribbled Julia's words in rushed handwriting. She read the address twice, memorizing it before shoving the paper into her pocket. She did, she said, and I want to go now. David exhaled. Beth, I know you want answers, but you need to think this through. We don't even know if we can see her without legal permission. We can't just walk in and take her. Bethany knew he was right. The logical part of her mind told her this wasn't something she could fix in a single night. But another part of her, the part that had spent the last few days unraveling lie after lie, felt an urgent need to do something. Maria was alone. She had been discarded like she didn't matter, and Bethany couldn't let that stand. I just need to see her, she said quietly. I need to know she's okay. David looked at her for a long moment before nodding. All right, let's go. The sun had long since set as they drove through the unfamiliar city streets. The air outside was thick with humidity, street lights casting elongated shadows across the pavement. The address Julia had given them led to a quiet, slightly worn-down part of town. It wasn't exactly a bad area, but it wasn't ideal either. When they finally pulled up in front of the children's home, Bethany felt her pulse quicken. The building was old but well-maintained, a red brick structure with barred windows and a playground enclosed by a chain-link fence. The sign above the entrance read, St. Helena's Home for Children. Bethany's hands clenched in her lap. It didn't look bad, but it didn't look like a home either. As she and David got out of the car, Bethany felt a wave of unease settle in her chest. She had no idea what to expect. Inside, the building was quiet. The reception area was small and functional, with a few chairs and a desk cluttered with paperwork. A tired-looking woman sat behind the desk, flipping through a file. She glanced up as Bethany and David approached. "Can I help you?" Bethany hesitated. She hadn't planned exactly what to say. David, sensing her uncertainty, stepped forward. "We're looking for a little girl named Maria Peterson," he said, his voice steady. "We were told she's staying here." The woman frowned slightly and adjusted her glasses. "And you are?" Bethany forced herself to stay calm. My husband was her father." The woman's gaze sharpened. "Her father?" Bethany nodded. "Richard Peterson. He passed away last year. We only just found out about Maria." The woman's expression softened slightly, but she still looked wary. "I see. Well, I can't disclose any information about the children here without proper authorization." Bethany expected that, but the frustration still flared inside her. "I don't need her records," she said quickly. I need to see her, just for a moment." The woman sighed. "Look, I understand this is a delicate situation, but we have strict policies. If you're interested in fostering or adopting, there's a process." Bethany shook her head. "I just want to make sure she's okay." The woman hesitated, glancing between Bethany and David. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled. "I can't promise anything, but I'll check if she's available. Wait here." Bethany's heart pounded as the woman disappeared down a hallway. David leaned closer. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Bethany's throat was dry, but she nodded. "I have to be." Minutes stretched on endlessly, then finally footsteps echoed from the hall. Bethany straightened, her breath catching in her throat, and then she saw her. A small girl with blonde curls and wide, gray-blue eyes stood in the doorway. She was wearing a simple dress, her hands folded behind her back. She looked uncertain, hesitant. Bethany's heart clenched. Mariah. She looked so much like Richard, but there was something else, something that made Bethany's chest ache. The little girl looked lonely. Maria's gaze flickered between Bethany and David, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't say anything. Bethany took a slow step forward, crouching slightly to be at eye level. "Hi, Maria," she said gently. The girl didn't move. Bethany's stomach twisted. Did she even know who Richard was? Did she miss him? Had Julia poisoned her against him, against his memory? The silence stretched until finally Maria spoke. "Are you here for me?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Bethany's throat tightened. "Yes," she said softly. "I wanted to meet you." Maria's eyes searched her face, looking for something. Bethany didn't know what. Then the girl took a hesitant step forward. "Is my dad coming too?" Bethany's breath caught. David stiffened beside her. Bethany swallowed past the lump in her throat. "No, sweetheart, he's not." Maria frowned slightly. "He's been gone a long time," she murmured. Bethany felt tears sting her eyes. Maria didn't sound upset. She sounded like a child who had already accepted too much loss. It broke Bethany's heart. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small stuffed bear. She hadn't known what to bring, but she had stopped at a store on the way, hoping it might be something small, something comforting. Maria's gaze flickered to the bear. She hesitated for only a moment before reaching out and taking it. Her small fingers curled around it tightly. Bethany watched as Maria hugged the bear close to her chest, her tiny shoulders trembling slightly. Something inside Bethany cracked. This child, Richard's child, had been left to grow up alone, and she couldn't let that happen. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know what legal battles they would have to fight. But she knew one thing. Maria wasn't going to be alone anymore. She had a brother. She had a grandmother. And, if Bethany had anything to say about it, she had a mother too. Later that night, as she and David drove back to their hotel, Bethany finally spoke. "I want to bring her home." David nodded, as if he had already known she would say that. "I figured." Bethany turned to look at him. "Will you help me?" David met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "You already know the answer to that." Bethany let out a slow breath. Tomorrow they would start figuring out how to bring Maria home, because she deserved a family. And Bethany was going to make sure she had one. The night was restless. Bethany lay awake in the dim glow of the hotel room, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts an endless spiral. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Maria's face, the cautious eyes, the way she clutched the stuffed bear, the smallness of her voice when she asked if her father was coming. "Is my dad coming too?" That single question had sliced through Bethany more deeply than anything else in the past 24 hours. Richard had left this girl behind. Julia had abandoned her. And yet, somehow, Maria had survived. Bethany turned her head slightly, glancing at David. He was sitting in the armchair near the window, staring out at the city lights, his jaw tense. Neither of them had been able to sleep. "We can't leave her here," Bethany whispered, breaking the silence. David exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I know." Bethany swallowed hard. She's been alone for too long. David finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You're really sure about this?" Bethany sat up. "Yes. She's Richard's daughter, and she's just a kid. I can't walk away knowing she's here, waiting for someone who's never coming back." David nodded, as if he had already expected this answer. "Then we need to figure out how to do this the right way." Bethany ran a hand through her hair, already overwhelmed. "I don't even know where to start." David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Adoption isn't simple, especially since neither of us are blood relatives." Bethany's stomach twisted. "You are. You're Richard's cousin." "Yeah, but that might not be enough," David said carefully. "And even if it is, they're not going to let a single man adopt a child that easily." Bethany's heart sank. "Then what do we do?" David hesitated, and then he said something that made Bethany's breath catch. "We could get married." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Bethany's first reaction was shock, then confusion, then 1,000 emotions she couldn't begin to process. David must have seen it on her face because he quickly added, "I know it sounds crazy, but think about it. A stable, 2-parent household. That's what they're looking for. If we got married, it would make the process easier." Bethany's pulse pounded. "David!" "I'm not saying we have to be a real couple," he said quickly. "It would just be on paper, a way to bring Maria home." Bethany's hands gripped the blanket on her lap. A marriage of convenience, a logical solution to an impossible situation. She should have been hesitant. She should have been scared. But instead, she thought of Maria, alone in that children's home, waiting. And suddenly, the decision didn't seem so difficult. Bethany met David's gaze. "Okay," she said. The next morning, Bethany felt a strange sense of determination settle over her. The uncertainty and emotional turmoil of the night before hadn't disappeared, but they had transformed into something more focused. There was no more doubt. She was going to do whatever it took to bring Maria home. When they arrived at the children's home again, the same receptionist from the night before greeted them with a curious look. "You're back," she noted. Bethany nodded. "We'd like to talk to someone about starting the adoption process for Maria Peterson." The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded and gestured for them to sit. "Give me a moment. I'll get the director." Bethany's hands trembled slightly, as she sat in one of the worn waiting room chairs. This was happening. David sat beside her, silent but solid, a steady presence at her side. A few minutes later, an older woman with short gray hair and kind eyes entered the room. She introduced herself as Mrs. Harding, the director of the facility. "I understand you're interested in adopting Maria?" she asked, taking a seat across from them. Bethany nodded. "Yes. We just found out about her recently. My late husband, Richard Peterson, was her father." Mrs. Harding's eyes flickered with recognition. "Ah, yes, I recall seeing his name on her file. It was a complicated situation." "That's putting it lightly," Bethany muttered. Mrs. Harding gave her a sympathetic look before glancing between her and David. "And you are?" she asked, addressing him. "David Peterson," he said. "Richard was my cousin." Mrs. Harding nodded, folding her hands on the desk. "I appreciate that you're both here. Maria is a sweet child, but she's been through a lot. When her mother left, she didn't say much, just that she couldn't take care of her anymore." Bethany's heart ached at the thought. "Did Maria seem upset?" Mrs. Harding sighed. "She's a quiet one. She doesn't talk about her mother much, and she barely mentions her father. I think, in her mind, she's already accepted that she's on her own." Bethany clenched her jaw. No, Maria wasn't on her own anymore. "We want to take her in," Bethany said firmly. Mrs. Harding hesitated. "I understand that, but the process isn't that simple. There are legalities, background checks, home visits." Bethany nodded. "We're prepared for that." The director studied her carefully. "Are you married?" Bethany barely hesitated. "Yes." David glanced at her briefly but didn't contradict her. Mrs. Harding tilted her head. "How long?" Bethany forced herself to stay calm. "A few months. We didn't expect to be in this situation, but now that we know Maria exists, we want to do what's best for her." Mrs. Harding tapped her fingers against the desk. "A stable home is what she needs. The fact that you're related to her father is in your favor, but you'll still need to prove that you can provide for her emotionally and financially." Bethany straightened. "We can?" Mrs. Harding smiled faintly. "Then let's start the paperwork." Relief flooded Bethany's chest. This was real. It was happening. An hour later, after filling out endless forms and answering what felt like 1,000 questions, Mrs. Harding gave them permission to visit Maria again. Bethany's nerves were on edge as they followed her through the hallways. When they stepped into the small visitation room, Maria was already there, sitting on a chair with the stuffed bear Bethany had given her the night before. She looked up at them, her big blue eyes unreadable. Bethany knelt in front of her. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. Maria clutched the bear tighter. "You came back." Bethany swallowed the lump in her throat. "Of course I did." Maria looked at David. "Is he your husband?" Bethany hesitated for only a second. "Yes." Maria frowned slightly. "Then does that mean you're my new mom?" Bethany's breath caught. She had no right to claim that title, but she wanted to, more than anything. She reached out, gently brushing a curl from Maria's forehead. "I'd like to be," she whispered. Maria stared at her for a long moment. Then, to Bethany's complete shock, she crawled into her lap and pressed her tiny face against her shoulder. Bethany froze. Then she wrapped her arms around the child, holding her close. Maria's small body trembled slightly, and Bethany realized this little girl had never truly been held before. Bethany closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wouldn't fail her. She wouldn't abandon her. Maria had a family now, and Bethany would fight to keep her. Bethany held Maria close, her arms wrapped protectively around the small frame of the girl who had already endured more loss and abandonment than any child should. The warmth of the child's body against hers was both grounding and heartbreaking. She felt Maria's tiny fingers grip the fabric of her shirt, as if she were afraid Bethany might let go. Bethany wouldn't. She couldn't. David stood beside them, watching in silence. His normally steady demeanor held a hint of something deeper, something unreadable. Bethany knew he felt it too. Maria needed them, and there was no way in hell they were leaving without her. Bethany lifted her gaze, meeting Mrs. Harding's eyes. The director's expression was carefully neutral, but Bethany could tell she was observing them closely, analyzing every detail of their interaction. Bethany knew what this moment was. It was a test. The woman had spent years placing children in homes, ensuring they ended up with people who would love them, protect them, and now she was deciding whether Bethany and David were those people. Bethany adjusted Maria slightly in her arms. "We want to take her," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Mrs. Harding sighed, folding her hands on the table in front of her. "Bethany, I understand that you feel a connection to Maria, and it's clear she's already attached to you. But adoption is a legal process. It's not something that can happen overnight." Bethany clenched her jaw. "Then tell me what we need to do." Mrs. Harding regarded her carefully. "For starters, we need to establish that Maria is eligible for adoption. Since her mother voluntarily relinquished her parental rights, that simplifies the process somewhat. But you'll need to go through an application, home study, and background checks before any placement can be considered permanent." Bethany's chest tightened. She had known it wouldn't be simple, but hearing it laid out so clinically made it feel impossible. Maria shifted in her arms. "Do I have to stay here?" the little girl whispered. Bethany's heart cracked wide open. Mrs. Harding hesitated before replying. "For now, yes. But if everything goes well, we can discuss temporary guardianship while the adoption is processed." Bethany nodded, her mind already racing. "How long will that take?" Mrs. Harding exhaled. "It depends. If you're serious about this, we can expedite certain steps. But you need to understand, this isn't just about filing paperwork. Maria has been through a lot. We need to make sure this placement is in her best interest." Bethany tightened her grip on Maria. "I understand." David finally spoke. "What about me?" Mrs. Harding turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" David straightened. "I'm Richard's cousin. Does that help?" Mrs. Harding considered this. "It might. Blood relations are sometimes given priority, but you're not an immediate guardian, and as a single man, it would be more difficult for you to adopt on your own." Bethany saw the way David's jaw tightened, as if he already knew what Mrs. Harding was going to say next. "Typically," the director continued, "the system prefers two-parent households for stability. A married couple has a stronger chance of approval." Silence filled the room. Bethany could feel David looking at her. She knew exactly what he was thinking, and she knew what she had to say. "We are married." The words left her mouth before she could second-guess them. Mrs. Harding blinked. "You are?" Bethany nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. "Yes. We didn't know about Maria until recently, but now that we do, we want to take care of her together." David didn't contradict her. Bethany knew this was a gamble, but she also knew that Maria's best chance was with them. Mrs. Harding studied them for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "then let's start the process." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, background checks, and endless paperwork. Bethany and David returned home, their house feeling emptier than ever without Maria there. But they knew this was just the beginning. Social workers visited their home, assessing whether it was a suitable environment for a child. Bethany spent hours making sure everything was perfect, child-proofing cabinets, setting up a bedroom, ensuring Maria would have everything she needed. Every night she lay awake thinking about Maria, wondering if she was okay, wondering if she missed them as much as Bethany missed her. David was a steady presence through it all. He handled the legal side of things, navigating the endless bureaucratic maze of adoption laws. They worked together, side by side, their shared goal uniting them in a way that felt more real than anything else ever had. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, they got the call. Temporary guardianship was approved. Maria was coming home. Bethany stood in the hallway of the children's home, her heart pounding. David was beside her, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Harding reappeared, leading Maria by the hand. The little girl's eyes lit up when she saw them. Bethany crouched down, holding out her arms. Maria hesitated only for a moment before running into her embrace. Bethany held her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We're taking you home, sweetheart." Maria clung to her. Bethany closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, something inside her finally felt right. The drive home felt surreal. Maria sat in the back seat, her small hands clutching the stuffed bear Bethany had given her on their first meeting. She didn't say much, her wide blue eyes watching the world pass by outside the window. Every so often, she would glance at Bethany or David, as if trying to reassure herself that this wasn't another temporary arrangement. Bethany felt an ache deep in her chest at the thought. Maria had been abandoned before. By the woman who should have loved her most. That would never happen again. David was quiet as he drove, his hands steady on the wheel. The weight of responsibility was heavy between them, though neither of them spoke it aloud. This was real now. Maria was their responsibility. As they pulled into the driveway of the house, Bethany turned to Maria with a soft smile. "We're home," she said gently. Maria looked at the house, her expression unreadable. Bethany had spent the past week preparing the guest room, turning it into a space fit for a little girl. She had repainted the walls in soft pastels, filled the shelves with books and toys, and carefully placed a new bed with fresh sheets in the corner. She wanted Maria to feel like she had a place here, that this was her home, too. David parked the car and got out, walking around to open the back door. Maria hesitated for only a moment before unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out, her grip on the stuffed bear tightening. Bethany held out her hand. Maria hesitated again. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Bethany swallowed against the sudden lump in her throat. She led Maria inside, her heart hammering as she watched the little girl take in the surroundings. The house was warm, inviting, the faint scent of vanilla lingering from the candle Bethany had lit before they left. Jaden, Bethany's son, was sitting on the couch when they entered. He had been curious when she told him about Maria, but he had been reserved about the idea of suddenly having a sister. Bethany had worried about how he would react. Now, as he stood up and looked at Maria, she held her breath. Maria stared at him. Jaden stared back. Then, finally, he spoke. "Hi." Maria didn't respond right away. She shifted slightly, glancing at Bethany as if for reassurance. Bethany smiled at her encouragingly. Maria took a breath. "Hi." Jaden studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "I like your bear." Maria clutched it tighter. His name is Mr. Buttons. Jaden nodded again. Then, to Bethany's surprise, he walked over to the coffee table, picked up one of his action figures, and held it out. "Here," he said, "this is Captain Zoom. He's kinda cool." Maria hesitated before slowly reaching out and taking the toy. Bethany's chest tightened at the sight. A small, tentative connection. It was a start. That night, Bethany helped Maria get settled in her new room. She showed her the bookshelves, the closet filled with clothes that Bethany had picked out, the small nightlight that cast a soft glow over the walls. Maria sat on the bed, looking around with careful eyes. Bethany sat beside her. "Do you like it?" she asked. Maria nodded slowly. Bethany hesitated before reaching out to smooth back a strand of Maria's golden hair. "This is your home now, sweetheart. You don't have to be afraid." Maria looked up at her. "I won't have to leave?" Bethany's heart clenched. "No," she said firmly, "you're staying right here." Maria studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Bethany leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "Good night, baby girl." Maria hesitated. Then, in the smallest whisper, she said, "Good night." Bethany turned off the light and left the door slightly open, just in case Maria woke up in the night and felt scared. As she walked down the hall, she ran into David. "She okay?" he asked quietly. Bethany nodded, but emotion swelled in her chest. "She just needs time." David exhaled. "We all do." Bethany looked up at him. She had never expected this, never expected to be here, standing beside David, forming a family neither of them had planned for. But somehow it felt right. David studied her for a long moment. Then, in a soft voice, he said, "We're doing the right thing, Beth." Bethany took a breath and nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "we are." The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the kitchen as Bethany stood at the counter, pouring a cup of coffee. The house was quiet, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. It had been a few days since Maria had moved in, and she was slowly adjusting to her new home. Bethany had noticed the small changes, how Maria hesitated a little less before entering a room, how she started responding when Jaden asked her questions, how she clung to the stuffed bear a little less tightly when she went to sleep. It was progress. Slow, steady progress. She turned at the sound of footsteps and saw David walking into the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck. His hair was slightly disheveled, evidence of a restless night. "She's up?" he asked. Bethany shook her head. "Not yet, but I think she's sleeping better." David nodded, grabbing a mug and pouring himself some coffee. "That's a good sign." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their drinks. Then David glanced at her. "You okay?" Bethany exhaled slowly. "Yeah." But even as she said it, she knew there was still one thing left to do. One last piece of her past that needed to be dealt with. David seemed to read her thoughts. The garage. Bethany nodded, setting down her mug. "I need to go back. One last time." David studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'll come with you." Bethany felt a wave of gratitude. She didn't say anything, just reached out and squeezed his hand before heading to get ready. The drive to the garage felt different this time, less daunting, less painful. She had spent the last few weeks uncovering the truth about Richard, unraveling the lies he had hidden for years. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it was no longer all-consuming. She had found Maria. She had built something new. She wasn't trapped in the past anymore. As David pulled up in front of the garage, Bethany took a deep breath. The air smelled of dust and metal, a familiar scent that brought back memories she had no use for anymore. The lock was still broken from when they had first opened it, and as David pushed the door open, Bethany stepped inside, her eyes scanning the space. The photographs were still there, the ones of Julia, the ones of Maria as a baby, the ones of Richard with them. Bethany walked toward the wall covered in images, running her fingers over the edges of a few. She had memorized every face, every moment captured on film, and now it was time to let them go. She grabbed a box from the corner and started pulling down the pictures, one by one. David watched her for a moment before joining her. They worked in silence, carefully removing every trace of Richard's secret life. Bethany knew she couldn't erase what had happened. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose what to carry forward. She kept only one photograph, a picture of Richard holding Maria in his arms, a rare, genuine smile on his face. It wasn't for her. It was for Maria. One day, when she was older, she might want to know who her father was. And when that day came, Bethany wanted to be able to tell her the truth, not out of anger or resentment, but out of love. Because no matter what Richard had done, Maria deserved to know that she had been wanted, even if it hadn't been in the way she should have been. By the time they finished, the garage was nearly empty. Bethany stood in the center of the space, taking one last look around. David leaned against the doorway. "You ready?" Bethany took a breath. Then she nodded. "Yes." David walked over and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. As they stepped outside, Bethany pulled the garage door closed behind her. With a final, decisive motion, she locked it. The past was behind her now, and she was ready for whatever came next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Watch the next video or check out others you might like. And if you enjoyed this one, share it with your friends.